The vocational beauty education sector projects an image of rigid structural integrity, but beneath that polished surface lies a network of deep systemic fractures. This outlines the scale of failure. Research projects more than 40% of cosmetology programs will fail federal gainful employment benchmarks, the highest failure share of any sector. By December 2024, 83 U.S. cosmetology schools were under heightened federal cash monitoring. These outcomes present a glaring contradiction when looking at the primary stated purpose of the agencies overseeing these schools: state cosmetology and barger boards. In Section 1.1 of this regulatory analysis, boards uniformly assert public protection as their reason for existing. The Ohio State Cosmetology Board explicitly states its mission is to protect and support the public. The Mississippi Board uses nearly identical language. This mandate to protect the public is the foundational justification for the state's entire apparatus of required licensure hours, mandatory inspections, and approved core curricula. If the regulatory structure is entirely built on public protection, how can this sector consistently produce such widespread, documented negative outcomes for its students? The answer lies in what researchers identify as the definition-representation gap. This is the expansive gray area between what the law technically requires on paper and how these institutions actually represent themselves to the public in practice. This crisis stems from the systemic exploitation of the space between minimal legal compliance and actual, observable ethical transparency. To see exactly how this gap is exploited, we first have to look at the physical space where students spend most of their time, the beauty school clinic floor. State cosmetology regulations universally maintain a strict legal wall between a commercial salon and an educational school clinic. As ACALed in Section 1.3, Minnesota's administrative code requires services performed within a school clinic to be clearly identified as unregulated services. These rules exist to protect consumers who are interacting with students in training, rather than licensed professionals. Yet, if you look at how these schools actually market themselves on social media and in local advertising, that strict legal distinction frequently vanishes. Schools frequently describe their clinic floors using language designed to invite walk-in clients with full commercial salon-level expectations, completely obscuring the supervised educational nature of the environment. This marketing misalignment creates an immediate lose-lose scenario. The consumer sits in the chair expecting the speed and polish of a master stylist, and the student is subjected to intense, unrealistic commercial pressure before they even hold a license. While the clinic floor legally exists to be a safe, supervised classroom, industry marketing functionally transforms it into a high-pressure, unregulated commercial salon. That same misalignment extends from the physical clinic floor right into the legal instruments that bind students to these schools, the enrollment contracts. It is true that state regulations dictate specific minimum content requirements for what goes inside these agreements. According to Section 1.4 of the analysis, Tennessee requires that enrollment agreements specify clock hours and clearly state refund policies. Illinois law similarly mandates a clear and conspicuous caption detailing a student's right to cancel. But these statutes share a critical blind spot. They regulate exactly what must be written inside the contract, but they almost never dictate how or when that document must be made accessible to the prospective student. Because the law doesn't explicitly require public posting, the industry norm is to treat these legally binding contracts as internal documents. They are kept entirely out of sight, presented only at the point of intake. This means a student is handed a binding financial document during or immediately after a campus visit, right when they've just made an emotional decision to enroll. It creates an environment of intense, implicit signing pressure. Federal Title IV regulations were actually designed to prevent exactly this kind of scenario. Reviewing Section 1.2, Title 34 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 668.501, explicitly prohibits demanding or pressuring a student to make enrollment or loan-related decisions immediately. It strictly bars schools from discouraging students from consulting an advisor or family member. But by hiding the contract until the student is already sitting in the intake chair, institutions effectively bypass those federal protections. When a student hasn't had time to share the contract with a financial advisor or a parent, informed consent collapses into a mere formality. Exploiting this accessibility blind spot
institutions successfully weaponize a legal instrument of protection, turning it into a high-pressure point-of-sale closing tool. This raises an obvious question. How do these practices survive nationwide in an industry that is so heavily regulated? The answer is found in the structural overlap within the regulatory bodies themselves. There is a documented conflict of interest between private school owners and the state boards tasked with overseeing them. For instance, in New York, school officials serve on the advisory committee that counsels on licensing standards. In Iowa, a high-ranking official from a chain that faced multiple fraud-related lawsuits held a seat on the State Board of Barbering and Cosmetology Arts and Sciences. This structural overlap generates informal shadow norms rather than rigorous public protection. Board guidance often reflects industry revenue interests, leaving the statutory mandate for safety as a secondary concern. This creates a pervasive fine-line compliance culture. Institutions do the absolute technical minimum required by law on paper, while running their clinics and enrollment offices entirely to maximize student acquisition and revenue. And the national accrediting bodies fail to close this loop. As detailed in Section 2.4, NACACS establishes baseline consumer information standards, but they do not require schools to make enrollment contracts publicly accessible online, nor do they mandate that schools afford students time to consult advisors before signing. When industry insiders regulate their own industry, minimum legal compliance stops being a tool to protect students. Instead, it becomes a shield used to protect institutional revenue. But this fine line culture is not an absolute requirement of doing business. There is a documented, functional alternative, the ethical transparency model. Louisville Beauty Academy, a state-licensed and accredited beauty college in Kentucky, provides an observable, public case study for this exact model of overcompliance. Looking at Section 3.1, LBA explicitly describes its clinic floor not as a commercial salon, but as a supervised school training environment. They actively warn volunteers to arrive with low salon outcome expectations, directly addressing the misalignment before a client ever sits in a chair. They apply this same radical clarity to the accessibility gap. Instead of hiding it in an intake office, the institution's standard enrollment contract is posted publicly online. It is available to anyone at any time with zero restrictions. This open-source accessibility is paired with a strict zero-pressure enrollment doctrine. LBA publicly tells students they will never rush them to sign, and affirmatively encourages them to take the contract home to review it in full with someone they trust. This model even integrates stark academic realities directly into the legal agreement itself. Official state licensing exam outcome data is embedded right into the contract, requiring a mandatory electronic signature and acknowledgement from the student. The ethical transparency model functions precisely because it treats federal laws prohibiting high-pressure tactics as a starting baseline to build upon, rather than a ceiling to hide beneath. This documented benchmark of overcompliance provides a clear roadmap for necessary sector-wide policy reforms. First, state boards must require all institutions to post standard enrollment contracts in publicly accessible digital locations. Second, boards must implement mandatory cooling-off periods. This ensures prospective students have time to review the contract with advisors before an agreement is accepted. Accrediting bodies like NACACS must also reform their site visit criteria. They need to actively evaluate whether a school's public communications actually align with their regulatory obligations, effectively ending the clinic floor illusion. But the ultimate institutional reform goes beyond what is strictly required by the state. It involves the maintenance of public law libraries. Schools truly committed to ethical transparency host open digital repositories containing the state statutes, complaint procedures, and board regulations that govern their operations, making them easily accessible to the entire community. This represents a distinct shift. It moves the industry away from hidden adversarial compliance and toward a model of open, democratized legal literacy. Vocational beauty education fulfills its public protection mission only when institutions treat the law as a fully transparent, shared public resource rather than a checklist of hidden rules.